My guest in this episode could be considered the godfather of the faith-based film genre.
I want you to rest well, and a month from now, this Hollywood big shot's gonna give you what you want.
It's too late. They start shooting in a week.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
He's the executive vice president of Affirm Films, the faith-based imprint of Sony Pictures. His name is Rich Peluso. Welcome to episode 11 of the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast. The Ministry of Motion Pictures exists to advance the art of Christian filmmaking. We seek to encourage, educate, equip, and challenge Christian filmmakers to become a revolutionary generation in the cinema. I'm animation director and filmmaker Todd Schaefer, and your host. Rich Peluso has been in the Christian film industry since Facing the Giants was released by Sony in 2006. Since then, he's been on the front lines watching, coaching, and driving the modern Christian film era, and as we may be entering a new era of Christian film, Mr. Peluso remains as important a figure in the faith-based space as he ever has. And in spite of the success he's seen in his career, he desires to see Christian films advance much farther than we've seen in the past 15 years. And now here he is, Rich Peluso. I'm so thankful that you've given me your time to do this. I'm looking forward to hearing the wisdom that you have after all these years of working in the Christian film industry. Why don't you start off by telling me a little bit about your history and how you got into Christian film and then Affirm?
Well, Todd, it's great to be here, and thank you for allowing me this opportunity to talk about the Affirm Films and what we do. So I got my start in the entertainment space back in 1991 when I was hired as a sales and marketing rep for a small Christian record company that was funded and started by a gentleman by the name of Bill Gaither. A lot of people might know his name.
The singer?
Early days of Southern gospel and Christian music back in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, Bill Gaither, the singer.
Exactly, Bill Gaither, Bill and Gloria Gaither, and he had a little record company he invested in called Jubilee Communications, and the record label was called Star Song Records, and I started there. I spent 15 years in Christian music, ended up the president of EMI Christian Music Group, and then I was through amazing circumstances ended up meeting some people at Sony Pictures, and they invited me to come on board and help launch their faith-based studio imprint. And so I left the music business and went into film, and we started Affirm Films back in 2007.
Wow.
And we were originally focused on trying to find, existing films that were made independently and acquiring those rights, but there really wasn't a lot that we felt was strong enough really to kind of live in the theatrical environment. So shortly after forming, we started to actually develop and produce our own content.
So what precipitated their interest in doing this?
Well, they had acquired a church-made little film called Facing the Giants that was produced out of a little church called Sherwood Baptist Church. It's really not that little, but out of Albany, Georgia. And there were two brothers that were pastors there, and they were Alex and Stephen Kendrick, and they love to write and produce films, and they shot this little movie for not a lot of money and no known talent, and I think they even did most of their casting with a sign-up sheet in the foyer of the church. They wanted to license a song from a band named Third Day that was on a Sony record label, and so they had to inquire with Sony about licensing the song, and that's how that movie got on Sony's radar. And the decision was made to actually acquire the rights of this little film and put it out originally on DVD, and then the decision was made to give it a shot in theaters, and it really blew up relatively, for that scale and size. It ended up doing $11 million in the box office on a movie that cost $100,000 to make, and so...
That's incredible.
Sony decided they wanted to get into this business, and they found me and asked me to start it up for them.
So they started Affirm after they found that film or before they found it?
No, they acquired the film and they put it out in theaters, and they just stuck it on a kind of a little trade label that they have for little independent films that they acquire all the time at festivals and other places. And when it did so well, that's when they decided they wanted to put people and resources and energy behind it. And so they brought me on board to help name it and brand it and launch it and build a strategic plan for growing the business. And so it was after they acquired Face the Giants, and the next movie we did was Fireproof.
Right. So you are Affirm Films.
Well, we're a small team. We're 5 people, and together we are Affirm Films. It really does take a village.
Yeah.
And even though we are just 5 people at Affirm, we're part of Sony Pictures, so I kind of get to cheat, right? I have a whole legal team at Sony. I have a business affairs team. I have a marketing team. I have a production team. We're part of Sony Pictures, so I access all the back office and resources that Sony Pictures has for Columbia and Sony Pictures Animation and TriStar and all the different imprints that Sony manages.
So those films, those first Kendrick films, they sort of took the Christian film genre and turned it into a new direction at that point. And you were right there at the beginning of it.
Yeah, really before then, there was mainly just kind of biblical content. Before the Kendricks, there were a few things that you could you could call faith-based or faith-infused that were mainstream movies, things like Chariots of Fire or Shadowlands or what was the Nicholas Sparks book?
Oh, yeah.
With Mandy Moore. I fail to remember the title.
Yeah.
Anyone listening to this is probably screaming at their computer or their iPhone what the title is. But anyways, there were a few things that kind of skirted the edge. But what the Kendrick Brothers did, was they took and they kind of merged together faith-based film and storytelling with contemporary dramatic stories.
Right.
And did so in a way that spoke to the broken parts of the church and connected with the faith community, but also had some crossover appeal because they dealt with themes and issues that are broadly dealt with in the population. And so, what's amazing is a lot of people just think the Kendrick Brothers are preaching to the choir. I love what Alex Kendrick says. He says, so what? The choir is sick. And then the other thing is that, we have seen through Fireproof and Courageous and War Room, we've seen some pretty amazing numbers. 20 to 30% of the people walking into the theaters are not churchgoers.
Right.
They're seekers or they're agnostic, or faith isn't really a key part of their life, and they're responding to the trailer and materials. And War Room became the #1 movie in America the second week it was out, after Straight Outta Compton fell in its 3rd week. And so suddenly, War Room was the #1 movie in America, and we had a lot of people walking the theater wondering what it was, and so we had some great crossover appeal outside the core faith community.
Yeah, that's right. I remember when that came out, it was such a big hit, and it overtook everybody's expectations, even though the expectations were somewhat high. Yeah, it's funny that when you start talking about Chariots of Fire in the faith-based space, that was all the way back in '81. That was ancient history at the time, so not a lot had happened but since Chariots of Fire.
I break up the kind of faith-based space into a few different kind of eras, right? So you have the silent era and the early audio era in film, and actually there were a lot of faith-based films because the Bible as intellectual property, as storytelling, was so commonly understood and known across, potential populations. So there were actually a lot of biblical films, and then we kind of went into the 50s and 60s, or really the 50s and early 60s, and you had some of the big biblical epics. And then we entered into what I call the Dark Ages, okay, and 70s 70s, 80s, you had a lot of films that were centered on kind of contemporary cultural issues, sex and drugs and rock and roll. And, Chariots of Fire was one of the unusual ones that kind of popped up. And then you have what I call the modern era, really, which was kicked off with Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ in 2004.
Yeah.
That kind of woke up Hollywood and the film industry around the world, that there was an underserved audience
right.
that was very significant in size in response to these kinds of films.
So where do you see us now? Are we still in that modern age?
I think we're about to enter the postmodern. It's funny to use that old term, apply it to faith-based film. It's been 15 years since Passion. When Passion of the Christ came out in 2004, it was such a shock to the system. And I use that word system to talk about several things. I mean, that's Hollywood, that's the church, that's the faith community in general, that's moviegoers. I mean, people were just shocked.
Yeah.
And it took actually, a couple years for there to be a response to that. People were saying, wow, this might mean an influx of faith-based films. Well, there really was nothing until the Kendricks in 2006.
Yeah.
There was really nothing in 2007, and then Fireproof in 2008. So those first few early years after Passion of the Christ, there was only one or so faith-based film a year, and it was usually ours.
Right.
Well, in 2018, I think there was 40 faith-based films. Right, so we're kind of entering in this new space where there is an abundance of content coming out, and it's starting to permeate, digital platforms and television movies and theatrical films and event theatricals, which is kind of a new business, right? Event theatricals are kind of those 1 or 2 night special events.
Yeah.
That are booked in 600 or 700 theaters across the country, and they just, come in and out around just a couple days. And so, we definitely are, in 2019, we're in a different place than we were in, let's say, 2011 when we did Soul Surfer and Courageous, or even 2015 when we did War Room. I think we're in this kind of new phase where it's exploding, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of hits. There's a lot of misses, and there's a few hits.
So what are the weaknesses of these films that aren't hitting?
Well, let me turn that around on you, Todd, and focus in on what I think are the elements that are working for the hits. And I think just because I don't want to speak, negatively about other people's work, I'd rather focus on what's working and not working with what we do. And there's plenty that we've made mistakes on, but I think what's happening with the success of our films as they grow and impact is that we're working with 2 different kinds of filmmakers now, all right? So the first one are really the same filmmakers we work with, like the Kendricks early on, but they're different people. They're different professionals now, 10 years or 15 years later, and they're really good at what they do because they've had all this time and effort as they hone their craft.
Yeah.
And then the second group are more kind of established professional filmmakers that are seeing the growth of this space and the impact and the kind of the stigma is falling away.
Yeah.
As we attract, Academy Award winning actresses like, Helen Hunt, or bringing in, Dennis Quaid or Greg Kinnear or Jennifer Garner, right? So then suddenly you have directors and producers that are thinking, wow, this is a valid, channel to work in. And so we're starting to attract those more established filmmakers, many of them kind of brought up in the church or kind of returning to their faith. Someone like a Randall Wallace, an amazing writer-director. He wrote Braveheart, he directed Secretariat, and he did our film, Heaven is for Real. And I think he did that because of the successes we had the years prior to that. And so we are definitely attracting, a more experienced filmmaker and director, and then ultimately we're attracting more established talent and actors, actors and actresses that the faith community really responds to because they love a lot of these actors, and it kind of validates for them the quality of these particular films that are breaking out big. So that's really, I think, where the hits are coming from.
So the stories that you gravitate to, they're more literary adaptations, or are you open to films that are more original?
It's a great question, and the bottom line, Todd, is that we tend to respond to stories that are really powerful and well constructed, and but inside there, we lean into true story.
Right.
If we're going to tell a story about how God intersects with us, in this world, there are so many amazing stories where he does intersect with us that it kind of falls a little flat when you kind of construct fictional stories. I mean,
right.
It's almost like it's a puppet show about God when there's so many real stories about God's connection with us. So we lean into the true stories. We lean into strong IP, which is intellectual property.
Right.
And examples of that are kind of big source material pieces like best-selling books or documentaries or global news stories. And we look to adapt that content into a screenplay format.
Yeah, it's got that resonance when it's a true story that people gravitate to in this genre.
They do. I mean, you can test it at home if you're watching a movie on Netflix with your family, or we've tested it, in actual scientific testing that we do on broad releases. But if you take an audience and you sit them down in front of a movie that has anything to do with a hero, a human hero overcoming obstacles, whether it's a sports drama or it's Heaven is for Real or it's Soul Surfer or whatever it is, the first thing that audience wants to know when the movie is over is that a true story?
Yeah.
Because if it isn't, they kind of discount it, by 50% or so. If it's a true story, it excites them. It becomes real and aspirational for them, and it drives the word of mouth. It drives the engagement when they know it's a true story.
You've also produced fictional films.
We did a fictional film called Mom's Night Out.
Oh, yeah.
That did very, very well for us. It was fictional. It wasn't based on really big IP. It was kind of an experiment for us to try it out. But though it was fictional and it didn't have any, wasn't based on a best-selling book or an author, it rang familiar to people.
Yeah.
All right. It was, when you saw the marketing for it, you kind of got the feeling, that's like a clean Bridesmaids, right? It's like a fun girls' night out. And so there was a familiarity to it, which was attractive. Okay, it's hard to take a completely unknown story, unknown character, unknown scenes and situations, and try to get people to want to see it.
Right.
It's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. Do you find that the amount of Christian films that are being produced and released now, we're reaching sort of the maximum load, or do you feel that we could be doing more?
I don't know, Todd. I don't know if there's. I've kind of pontificated on the concept of capacity in the past, and I find that I really am not as smart as I think I am when it comes to that. I've kind of learned. I just learned and grown, and I've realized that I think there's kind of limitless capacity for really great entertainment. It's if there's a great, amazing film that connects with a broad audience and glorifies God and is powerful, I think you can see a lot of those come out in theaters. I think you'll have audiences embrace them. If we just try to grow the space through pure volume, and a lot of kind of pablum is created and a lot of kind of not very good content, then we're going to see what we've seen, in a few of the last couple of years, where we have a lot of projects hit theaters and they just don't find an audience because they kind of weren't really good.
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of well, I shouldn't say a lot. Unfortunately, have been incidences, where faith-based filmmakers and producers and the marketers, their big message out there is hey, this is faith-based film. Come support us, because if you support us, we're able to make more.
Right.
And that's not a very compelling message for a consumer.
No, it's not.
It's like, I don't want to support your movie. I don't want to help a brother out, just to help him out, and I have to sit through a bad movie and waste $100 to bring my family to see the movie. I want a great movie experience.
Right.
So we've got to focus on providing, greater stories and more well-made stories.
Yes. Yeah, I found out after I made my first film, suddenly people felt free to come up to me and tell me what they thought about faith-based films in general, and it's rarely positive.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is rarely positive.
And it just baffles me that Christians have found themselves in a place where we are sort of the underdogs and not very good at doing this cinematic thing.
A lot of people, they have limited resources, and they're trying to make the best they can with limited resources, and it begs the question of, is that the right thing to do? Should you not do that and kind of pool your resources and try to aspire for bigger projects? I don't know the right answer. Yeah. I know I'm blessed and fortunate to be at Sony, so we have a lot of resources, and we can kind of swing for the fence when we feel like we've got a really big story and we want to get some big talent, big filmmakers. But it's really hard, Todd. I wish I had a really great strategic plan for everybody to succeed in the space.
Yeah, for sure. And I also wonder if the fact that it's got such a stigma that Christians who are good at their craft, they're not in the space trying to do faith-based films, because one, it's not very profitable compared to working on some of these larger feature films or TV series. They can make a much better living doing that, and it's more stable. And it's sort of risky to jump into the faith-based space. Yeah,
I mean, there are a lot of strong believers that are part of movies that we see all the time, and we don't even know, and they're definitely in the world and not of the world, and they're out there, and I think it's great, and I get to actually participate in some of those things within Sony, because one of the things Affirm does is it besides doing what we do, we also act as kind of a good corporate citizen, within Sony Pictures, and so we connect with other various parts of Sony and other projects and shows and films, and there's a big Sony Pictures comedy TV show that's highly rated on a major network, and a couple of the actors on that show are really strong believers, and so we meet with them and we look at other projects that we might be able to plug them into. I hear from a lot of writers and producers that are out there that are believers and out there creating great content that you wouldn't know about. So there's definitely, I think God is working in the entertainment space. He's working in Hollywood in different ways. I think he's lifting up some of these faith-based filmmakers and allowing them to develop and learn their craft in a better way. And he's also, at work out in the mainstream entertainment space. And we see some amazing things happen. Look, take for example, Hacksaw Ridge. Okay, so that's a movie about a Desmond Doss, a man strong in his faith. And yes, the movie was incredibly violent and graphic, World War II violent graphic. But it's hard to find a more faith-centric story than what you found in Hacksaw Ridge.
Yeah, it was great.
I mean, Desmond was informed by his Christian faith. He prayed. He made sacrifices. He lived out a Christian life, an amazing life, and it was right there on the giant screen on a big-budgeted Hollywood movie. They're out there.
Yeah, that was an amazing story. They did a really good job with it. Well, it was Mel Gibson, so.
Yeah, exactly.
My conversation with Rich Peluso will continue in the next episode. Rich will give us what he considers to be the 10 success factors to any Christian film production. You don't want to miss it. Thank you for joining me on the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast. You'll find show notes and more information about us at ministryofmotionpictures.org.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.